It began with a letter that should never have existed. In October of 1871, just days after the flames of the Great Chicago Fire had reduced 3.5 square miles of the city to ash, a railway clerk named Thomas Whitaker found an envelope fused inside the warped iron frame of a postal sorting cabinet. The fire had burned hot enough to melt church bells and buckle steel rails. Yet this envelope, though browned at the edges, remained legible. It bore no stamp, no address, only 3 words written in precise, deliberate ink. He is not done. Thomas would later swear that the ink was still wet. The Great Chicago Fire is remembered as one of the most catastrophic urban disasters in American history. Between October 8th and October 10th, 1871, the inferno consumed thousands of buildings, left roughly 100,000 residents homeless, and reshaped the architectural future of the United States. But among the documented losses, warehouses, hotels, churches, rail depots, there was one structure curiously absent from official recovery records. A narrow 3-story boarding house on DeKoven Street, owned by a reclusive Civil War surgeon named Dr. Elias Mercer. No insurance claim was ever filed for the property. No survivors were registered from its address. And yet, in the months following the fire, residents rebuilding the South Division began reporting strange occurrences at the charred lot where Mercer's house had stood. Workers complained of tools vanishing, only to reappear arranged in precise rows. Night watchmen described faint lantern light flickering where no building remained. One man claimed he heard muffled knocking beneath the rubble, rhythmic and patient, as if someone were signaling from underground. City officials dismissed these accounts. Chicago had endured trauma on a scale difficult to fathom. Hallucination and rumor were expected. But Thomas Whitaker kept the letter. He could not explain why. Thomas was not a superstitious man. Born in 1844 in Ohio, he had enlisted at 17 in the Union Army and served in the Western Theater during the Civil War. He had seen Shiloh. He had marched through Tennessee. He believed in logistics, schedules, timetables. The railway was order. The railway was progress. Yet the envelope troubled him. There was no signature. Inside, a single sheet of heavy rag paper contained a message written in the same steady script. The fire was necessary. The interruption was not. He remains below. He remains unfinished. No date, no explanation. Thomas showed it to his supervisor, who laughed and suggested it was a cruel joke left by looters. But the phrasing gnawed at him. He had helped catalog burned parcels in the days after the fire. Nothing else had survived in such condition, and no one could explain how an unstamped, unaddressed envelope had entered a locked sorting cabinet before the blaze. Weeks passed. Reconstruction began. Chicago, resilient and defiant, vowed to rise from the ashes stronger than before. Architects drafted plans for fireproof buildings. Investors poured money into steel and stone. And then, in December of 1871, the first body was discovered. It was found by laborers clearing debris near the former site of Mercer's boarding house. The corpse was mummified, skin drawn tight against bone, clothing intact but antiquated, at least 20 years out of fashion. There were no burn marks, no obvious injuries, but the hands were positioned over the chest, fingers interlaced as though placed deliberately. The coroner's report noted something stranger still. The lungs contained no soot. Whoever the man was, he had not died in the fire. Police attempted to identify him through military records, dental characteristics, clothing manufacturers. No match was found.
Newspapers briefly covered the mystery before attention shifted back to the city's rapid rebuilding. Thomas attended the coroner's public inquest out of curiosity he struggled to justify. When he saw the body, a cold certainty settled over him. The man's face matched a sketch he had once seen in an army medical ledger. Dr. Elias Mercer. Mercer had served as a contract surgeon during the Civil War, primarily in makeshift field hospitals near the Mississippi River campaigns. Records described him as brilliant, but morally ambiguous. He had pioneered experimental procedures intended to preserve severely wounded soldiers who would otherwise perish. Some colleagues praised his innovation. Others accused him of prolonging suffering for the sake of observation. After the war, Mercer vanished from official rosters. Thomas had encountered his name years earlier while assisting with the transportation of medical supplies. There had been rumors, unverified, that Mercer believed death was not an endpoint but a reversible condition given sufficient understanding of the body's electrical impulses. It sounded like madness, and yet here lay Mercer's body, unburned beneath the ruins of a house consumed by one of the hottest fires in American history. The authorities concluded he must have died prior to the fire and been preserved beneath debris. But that explanation failed to address the condition of the remains, nor did it explain why several workers swore the lot had been thoroughly cleared weeks earlier. Thomas returned home unsettled. That night, he dreamed of knocking. Not loud, not frantic, a steady, measured tapping. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. When he awoke, the sound continued. It was coming from inside his wardrobe. Heart pounding, Thomas approached the wooden cabinet. The tapping ceased as his hand touched the handle. Slowly, he opened the door. Inside, resting atop folded shirts, was the same envelope, unburned, uncreased, as if newly placed. This time, the message differed. The shell decays, the current persists. Thomas did not scream, he did not run. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed until dawn, the letter trembling between his fingers, and tried to reason through the impossible. Perhaps someone was orchestrating an elaborate hoax. Perhaps he was suffering delayed trauma from the war and the fire. Perhaps grief and exhaustion had fractured his perception. But by morning, events escalated beyond rational dismissal. At the Mercer lot, a second body emerged. This one belonged to a woman approximately 30 years of age. Like Mercer, she showed no signs of fire damage. Her clothing suggested she had died in the late 1660s, and like Mercer, her hands were folded carefully over her chest. The newspapers began to whisper. The Chicago Tribune printed a small column questioning how 2 preserved corpses could lie beneath a property that had allegedly functioned as a simple boarding house. Rumors spread that Mercer had conducted private experiments in his basement. Former tenants were difficult to locate, most records had burned. But one elderly man came forward claiming he had briefly rented a room from Mercer in 1868. He described odd odors, electrical equipment imported from Europe, and nights when the floor vibrated faintly as though machinery operated below ground. Electricity in 1868 was still largely experimental. The telegraph had proven its communicative power, but widespread electrical infrastructure was decades away. If Mercer had been experimenting with electrical stimulation of tissue, he was operating at the very fringe of contemporary science. Thomas read every article obsessively. He began visiting the lot after his railway shifts, standing at the perimeter fence as workers dug deeper into the earth. Each evening, he half expected to see lantern light flicker where no lamp should burn. One frigid January night in 1872, he saw it. A pale glow emanated from a cavity in the ground, subtle but unmistakable. The workers had departed hours earlier. Compelled by a force he could neither name nor resist, Thomas slipped through a gap in the fence and descended into the excavation pit. The air grew colder as he approached the glow. It seemed to emanate not from flame, but from something phosphorescent, a soft blue shimmer pulsing in intervals. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats. The same rhythm as the knocking in his dream. He found a narrow stone staircase, partially revealed by the dig. It descended beneath what had once been Mercer's foundation. Thomas hesitated only briefly before lighting a match and beginning his descent. The stairs led to a subterranean chamber untouched by fire, stone walls, iron braces, and at the center of the room, a table, not a dining.
Thomas could not see the figure clearly in the darkness, yet he felt its gaze fix upon him with unnerving precision. "I did not send for you lightly," the voice rasped. The blue glow intensified, revealing more of the chamber in flickers. The glass jars overhead vibrated faintly with each pulse. The wires hummed like distant telegraph lines in a storm. Thomas forced himself to speak. "You're dead." A faint, brittle smile crossed the man's face. "I was." The word lingered in the cold air. Thomas stumbled backward until his shoulders struck the stone wall. His mind raced for a rational explanation, some trick of gaslight, some elaborate deception. Yet the rhythm of the apparatus, the crude batteries, the preserved bodies upstairs, these were tangible. The figure strained slightly against leather restraints. "The fire disrupted the cycle. I required intervention." "You're Mercer," Thomas whispered. "Yes." The name felt heavier in that room than it ever had in the pages of a ledger. Dr. Elias Mercer had been declared dead weeks earlier, his corpse identified in the rebel. Yet here lay a living, or partially living, duplicate. Thomas's thoughts collided. "They found your body." A slow blink. "A prior shell." The phrase echoed the letter. "The shell decays. The current persists." "You expect me to believe," Thomas began, but Mercer's voice cut through him. "Electricity animates muscle. You have seen frogs twitch beneath Galvani's probes." He referenced the Italian physician Luigi Galvani, whose late 18th century experiments had demonstrated that electrical stimulation could cause dead frog legs to contract. "You have heard of Alessandro Volta and his battery stacks. The principle is established." Thomas had indeed read newspaper accounts of galvanism demonstrations in Europe and America, public exhibitions where cadavers' limbs convulsed under electrical charge. Grim spectacles, but explainable. "This is not twitching." "No," Mercer agreed. "It is continuity." The jars above him pulsed again. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Thomas swallowed hard. "How many?" Mercer's gaze shifted briefly toward the staircase. 3 attempts. 2 stabilized insufficiently. Cellular degradation advanced beyond salvage. This iteration. He inhaled carefully. This iteration retains cohesion. The implications chilled Thomas more than the January air. The 2 bodies discovered in the rubble. The carefully folded hands. "You killed them." Mercer's expression hardened. "They volunteered." "For what?" "For transcendence." Outside, faint city sounds filtered down the stairwell, hammers striking beams, distant wagon wheels, the relentless reconstruction of Chicago. The world above pursued progress in steel and commerce, unaware that beneath its reborn streets, a different kind of ambition had taken root. Thomas steadied himself. "Why the letters?" Mercer's eyes sharpened. "Because the system requires calibration. I cannot maintain the apparatus alone in this state. The fire consumed key components. The current must remain consistent." Thomas shook his head. "Why me? You handled medical freight during the war. You are disciplined.
You understand machinery. And you did not discard the first letter. A wave of nausea swept over Thomas. You were watching me. I anticipated you. The blue light flickered, dimmed, then surged brighter. Mercer grimaced as if in pain. The interruption grows, he whispered. The batteries degrade. Without reinforcement, this vessel will fail. Thomas's instincts screamed to flee, to alert authorities, to collapse the chamber and bury whatever nightmare lay within. Yet another instinct, quieter, but persistent, held him in place. He had seen death in war. He had watched boys barely older than himself bleed into Tennessee mud. He had held friends whose eyes dimmed with final breaths. If Mercer had truly breached that boundary, what does it mean? What does it entail? What happens? Thomas whispered carefully. If you succeed. Mercer's lips parted in something like awe. Death becomes negotiable. The words hung heavy. Upstairs, Chicago's rebuilding embodied American resilience. Investors would soon fund innovations in steel frame construction. The city would pioneer architectural revolutions. But Mercer spoke of a revolution far more profound, one that would dismantle the ultimate human limitation. Thomas's mind raced through the possibilities and the consequences. If this becomes known, the government would weaponize it or suppress it. He coughed weakly. Progress requires discretion. The chamber vibrated again. One of the glass jars cracked with a sharp pop, liquid seeping down copper wiring. Mercer's body convulsed violently. Thomas lunged forward instinctively, gripping the edge of the table. Steady the north array. Mercer gasped. I don't know how. Replace the solution. Upper shelf. Third file. Thomas scrambled to the shelves, hands shaking. He found a sealed container labeled only with a chemical shorthand he vaguely recognized from wartime supply manifests. A copper sulfate solution. He climbed a small stool, unscrewed the fractured jar, and poured the new solution into place. The humming steadied. The blue pulse resumed its rhythm. Mercer exhaled. Silence returned, broken only by the faint electrical phenom. Thomas stared down at him. This isn't life, he said quietly. Mercer's eyes burned. It is persistence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Thomas asked the question that mattered most. What do you want from me? Mercer studied him, calculating. Assistance, secrecy, and time. Above them, Chicago's newspapers began reporting peculiar rumors. Additional skeletal remains uncovered beneath adjacent pots. Anonymous donors funding private electrical research in the Midwest. Telegraph operators complaining of strange interference on certain nights. Signals that pulsed in odd triple-beat rhythms before vanishing. The nation was entering a new era of invention. Thomas Edison was still a young man experimenting with telegraphic improvements. Alexander Graham Bell refining theories of voice transmission. The late 19th century would soon ignite with technological breakthroughs. And in a buried chamber beneath the city reborn from fire, Dr. Elias Mercer believed he stood at the threshold of the greatest breakthrough of all. Thomas looked once more at the staircase leading back to the surface. To law. To sunlight. To sanity. Then he looked at the apparatus. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. If Mercer was delusional, exposing him within the madness. If Mercer was right, Thomas felt the weight of history pressing inward. Show me, he said at last. Show me how it works. Mercer's smile was faint, but unmistakable. And above them, unnoticed by the rebuilding city, the ground seemed to settle, as if something deep beneath Chicago had drawn a careful, patient breath.
Mercer began his instruction not with theory, but with history. Electricity is not new, he whispered, his voice thin yet deliberate. It is merely misunderstood. From Leyden jars in Europe to battlefield telegraph lines across the Union, we have proven that current can travel, can carry information, can stimulate motion. Yet all physicians insist the soul is separate from the mechanism. Thomas adjusted a wire as directed, his fingers numb from cold and tension. And you disagree. I reject superstition disguised as philosophy, Mercer replied. Life is pattern. Pattern is signal. Signal can be sustained. The blue pulse brightened again, steadier now that the jar had been replaced. For the first time, Thomas noticed the apparatus was arranged with surprising precision. Copper coils aligned symmetrically, electrodes spaced with mathematical care, even the jars positioned in triangular arrays that resembled experimental diagrams he had once seen in scientific pamphlets imported from Europe. "You built all this alone?" Thomas asked. "Over years," Mercer said. "After the war, I withdrew from conventional practice. Too many surgeons accepted death as an inevitability rather than a failure of intervention." Thomas remembered the medical tents of the Civil War: sawdust floors, blood-soaked bandages, amputations performed at brutal speed. Thousands died not only from wounds but from infection and shock. Medicine was advancing, yet still crude by modern standards of the late 19th century. "You experimented on soldiers," Thomas said quietly. Mercer did not deny it. "I observed electrical responsiveness in recently deceased tissue," he said. Minutes after cessation, muscle fibers still react to stimulation. Hours later, diminished. Days later, absent. Therefore, the window is not instantaneous, it is gradual. Thomas swallowed. "That does not make them alive." "No," Mercer agreed. "But it proves death is a process, not an event." The distinction unsettled Thomas more than any supernatural explanation would have. Mercer gestured weakly toward a stack of journals on a nearby shelf. "Record everything you see tonight. Precision ensures continuity." Thomas hesitated before retrieving one of the leather-bound books. The pages were filled with dense notes, dates, voltage estimations, anatomical sketches, chemical formulas. Some entries reference contemporary scientists and experiments, galvanic stimulation trials in Europe, early battery refinements, medical debates on resuscitation techniques. But others were far more disturbing. Subject B, cardiac silence restored via rhythmic current for 47 seconds before tissue collapse. Subject C, consciousness uncertain, ocular tracking observed. Thomas closed the journal abruptly. "They volunteered," Mercer repeated, as if anticipating his reaction. "Or trusted you," Thomas replied. Silence stretched between them. Above, faint vibrations filtered through the ceiling, construction activity continuing even at late hours. Chicago's reconstruction was relentless. After the Great Fire of 1871, architects and engineers had pushed the limits of new building materials, determined to create a city less vulnerable to disaster. Iron and stone replaced timber. Fire coats strengthened. The skyline, though still modest, was evolving. Yet beneath that progress, Mercer's chamber remained untouched by official surveys. "How did this place survive the fire?" Thomas asked suddenly. Mercer's eyes flickered with something like satisfaction. "Stone foundation, reinforced substructure, and location." Location. "The house stood near the origin of the blaze," Mercer said. "The heat above was catastrophic, but the subterranean chamber was insulated by collapsed debris and soil. Ironically, destruction preserved the experiment." Thomas felt a chill unrelated to temperature. The very disaster that devastated thousands had protected this hidden laboratory. Another pulse of blue light surged. Mercer's chest rose and fell in the now familiar pattern. 3 breaths. Pause. 3 breaths. Thomas noticed something new. The rhythm matched the pulsing front exactly. "You've synchronized it," he murmured. Mercer's lips curved faintly. "Yes." A long silence followed as Thomas adjusted wires and replaced minor components under Mercer's guidance. Minutes blurred into an hour. Gradually, the chamber's hum stabilized. Then, without warning, a distant sound echoed from above. A faint, hollow thud. Thomas froze. Another thud followed. Then a third. 3 breaths. Pause. 3 breaths. He looked toward the staircase, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" Mercer's expression tightened. "They are digging deeper," he said. "Who?" "City crews, or investors. Land values here are rising rapidly after reconstruction. If they uncover the chamber, the implication was immediate and severe. Authorities would intervene, the apparatus would be dismantled, Mercer's work, however one judged it, would end." The thudding grew louder, muffled through layers of earth and debris. Thomas paced anxiously. "You can't remain here indefinitely. The site will eventually be redeveloped." "I know," Mercer said, "which is why continuity must be portable." Thomas stared at him. "You intend to move this entire system?" "Not the chamber," Mercer replied. "The principle." Another thud echoed above, followed by the faint scrape of metal against stone. Dust drifted from the ceiling. For the first time, fear crossed Mercer's face, not fear of death, but of interruption. "The journals," he said urgently. "You must remove them tonight. If the chamber is discovered, the records cannot fall into untrained hands." Thomas hesitated. "This is evidence." "This is knowledge," Mercer countered, "and knowledge, once seized by institutions, becomes weapon or spectacle." The thudding intensified. Cracks appeared along the upper stone arch. Thomas grabbed the journals, stacking them into a canvas railway satchel he had brought unconsciously, as though some part of him had anticipated this moment. "How many?" he asked. "All of them." He worked quickly, cart racing, as the sounds above grew louder. Voices faintly echoed, workers shouting measurements, tools striking hardened ground. Mercer closed his eyes briefly.
Listen carefully, Thomas. If the apparatus fails, this vessel will cease, but the method remains viable. With refinement, portable batteries, improved insulation, more stable current cycles, the process can be replicated. You're talking about rebuilding yourself, Thomas said. I am talking about extending continuity beyond a single body. A heavy metallic impact reverberated overhead. Stone dust cascaded down. For the first time, fear crossed Mercer's face, not fear of death, but of interruption. The journals, he said urgently. You must remove them tonight. If the chamber is discovered, the records cannot fall into untrained hands. Thomas hesitated. This is evidence. This is knowledge, Mercer countered. And knowledge, once seized by institutions, becomes weapon or spectacle. The thudding intensified. Cracks appeared along the upper stone arch. Thomas grabbed the journals, stacking them into a canvas railway satchel he had brought unconsciously, as though some part of him had anticipated this moment. How many? He asked. All of them. He worked quickly, heart racing, as the sounds above grew louder. Voices faintly echoed, workers shouting measurements, tools striking hardened ground. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Listen carefully, Thomas. If the apparatus fails, this vessel will cease, but the method remains viable. With refinement, portable batteries, improved insulation, more stable current cycles, the process can be replicated. You're talking about rebuilding yourself, Thomas said. I am talking about extending continuity beyond a single body. A heavy metallic impact reverberated overhead. Stone dust cascaded down. For the first time, fear crossed Mercer's face, not fear of death, but of interruption. The journals, he said urgently. You must remove them tonight. If the chamber is discovered, the records cannot fall into untrained hands. Thomas hesitated. This is evidence. This is knowledge, Mercer countered. And knowledge, once seized by institutions, becomes weapon or spectacle. The thudding intensified. Cracks appeared along the upper stone arch. Thomas grabbed the journals, stacking them into a canvas railway satchel he had brought unconsciously, as though some part of him had anticipated this moment. How many? He asked. All of them. He worked quickly, heart racing, as the sounds above grew louder. Voices faintly echoed, workers shouting measurements, tools striking hardened ground. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Listen carefully, Thomas. If the apparatus fails, this vessel will cease, but the method remains viable. With refinement, portable batteries, improved insulation, more stable current cycles, the process can be replicated. You're talking about rebuilding yourself, Thomas said. I am talking about extending continuity beyond a single body. A heavy metallic impact reverberated overhead. Stone dust cascaded down. Thomas slung the satchel over his shoulder. And the others? He asked, nodding toward the staircase. Mercer's voice softened. They were incomplete attempts. Their degradation exceeded recoverable thresholds. Thomas remembered the carefully folded hands of the bodies discovered above. Not discarded, positioned, respected, or arranged. Another strike, closer now. A thin beam of light pierced through a new crack in the ceiling. They're breaking through, Thomas hearted. Mercer's breathing quickened, disrupting the synchronized rhythm. The blue pulse flickered erratically. No, Mercer whispered. Not yet. The cycle is not stabilized. Thomas rushed to the apparatus. What do I do? Increase the current by 1 increment, slowly. If it surges, the neural cohesion will collapse. Thomas adjusted the copper regulator as instructed. Sparks snapped along the wire. The jurors vibrated violently before settling into a stronger, brighter pulse. Mercer gasped sharply, and then stilled. For a terrifying moment, his chest stopped moving. Thomas froze. Then, 3 breaths. Pause. 3 breaths. Stronger than before. Above them, a final deafening crash split the chamber ceiling as a pickaxe shattered through stone. Daylight flooded in through a jagged opening. A worker's voice shouted from above, startled. There's a hollow space down here. Another voice followed. Get a lantern. Careful. Structure might be unstable. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. Mercer's eyes locked onto him with intense urgency. Go, he whispered. Take the journals. Say nothing. History is not ready for this. Footsteps approached the opening overhead. Lantern light flickered through falling dust. Thomas hesitated only a second longer. Then he ran up the staircase, satchel clutched tightly, emerging into the freezing Chicago air, just as workers gathered around the newly exposed cavity. What's down there? One of them asked. Thomas forced himself to steady his voice. Collapsed foundation. Old storage space. Unstable. The foreman peered into the hole, but recoiled at the darkness and drifting dust. We'll seal it for now, he muttered. Reported to the survey office later. Boards were dragged over the opening. Earth was shoveled hastily back into place. Within minutes, the entrance was obscured beneath the city's relentless reconstruction. Thomas stood silently, the weight of the journals heavy against his side. Beneath his feet, faintly, so faintly he almost believed he imagined it. He felt a vibration through the ground. 3 breaths. Pause. 3 breaths. That night in his small rented room, Thomas spread the journals across his desk beneath lamplight. Page after page detailed years of experimentation, electrical schematics, physiological observations, and philosophical reflections on mortality that bordered on obsession. One entry, dated September 1871, just weeks before the Great Fire, caught his attention. If the urban infrastructure modernizes as projected, electrical distribution networks may eventually span entire cities. Should that occur, localized current limitations will no longer restrict continuity experiments. The implications would be profound. Thomas stared at the words, dread coiling in his chest. Chicago was rebuilding not just stronger, but more technologically ambitious than ever before. Telegraph lines expanded daily. Engineers discussed future electrical illumination systems. Inventors across America were racing toward innovations that would soon define a new industrial age. And Mercer had anticipated it, not as a convenience, but as an opportunity. As Thomas closed the final journal, the lamplight flickered unexpectedly. The flame dimmed, brightened.